Hello everybody. We are here, me, Jón Ingvar Kjaran, and
Guðrún Kristinsdóttir.
And in this short lecture we are going to talk about our study, our research, and the title is Working on the Self, and how perpetrators of intimate partner violence narrate on and position themselves during and after therapy, and we will come with some examples from Iceland. So I will start talking a little bit about this research, and then I will give the floor to my colleague Guðrún, and she will talk about the findings of the research. So a little bit about the introductions and our aims. So our aims in this study is to explore how violent men reconstitute their violent self by working on the self. So in other words, how did they, in Foucaultian terms, change or transform themselves by working on themselves through therapy and self-inspection? So all the participants in our study had received some kind of therapy and were under the influences of what we call the therapeutic discourse. Thus, in this study, we also want to analyze how these men draw on this kind of discourse when talking about themselves and their violent practices. So we seek to answer, in order to answer our questions, we interpreted the narratives of 7 research participants. And we draw on Foucault's work on the ethics of the self and studied how subjects apply various techniques of the self when taking care of and working on it. We are also inspired by the writings on confessional practices, particularly by Foucault, which aims at gaining the knowledge of the self and can be understood as a prerequisite to transform and improve the self. In discussing the process of self-improvement, Foucault's 4 ethical dimensions can be helpful to understand how the subject repositions the self and moves away from a certain state of being. So now we will turn to the discussion on theory and particularly focus on Foucault's writing on the ethics of the self. So in the first volume of the History of Sexuality, Michel Foucault discusses the genealogy of confessions in Western thought and draws attention to the importance of confessions in the constitution of the individual subject. Thus, confessions produce truth not only about the individual self, but also about others. So these practices became productive because speaking the truth about oneself also makes or construct some kind of forms of one's own self. And through these technologies, a human being turns himself into a subject. So confessions were all about knowing oneself in order to improve the self and renounce any sins in the presence of, for example, a priest or a pastor. Through these confessional practices, the subject created a new self who was pure and relieved from previous sins, according to Foucault. Today, it can therefore be argued that these confessionary practices or confessional practices play an important role in the construction of the postmodern subject by modifying the person to confess through the truth-telling and exposure of inner self. This is particularly true as regards to therapy and how the confessional subject gains knowledge of the self in the presence of the therapist. Thus, by confessing, one is not only exposing the inner self, which the confessor feels relieved, and in some kind of Christian sense, you gain salvation. But you're also taking a care about the self by talking about it. So that leaves us to Foucault's 4 ethical dimensions. So Foucault's 4 ethical dimensions are practices or activities which can have the purpose of repositioning the individual subject and moving him from or away from a disadvantaged state. So in case of our participants, from this violent state of being a violent man. The dimension overlap and work together in forming the practices of the self. And we have put on this slide the dimension. So the first dimension refers to the determination of ethical substance, which means that the individual subject must identify an aspect of the self which needs to be improved through ethics. So this depends on the subject position one takes each time. So for example, in case of our participants, violent men, one could assume that their ethical substance would be to admit and talk about their violent past. So this in many ways resembles the confessional practices discussed previously and the ways in which one gains knowledge of the self. So the second dimension is the mode of subjections, within which the individual positions himself in relation to certain discourses and norms. In this context, discourses and norms which regulate violent men are mainly the norms of how to act and behave as a man, and other conflicting discourses of masculinity. The third dimension is self-practice or ethical work, which entails, for example, asking questions: what are the means by which we can change ourselves in order to become an ethical subject? And then we have the last dimension, which Foucault called telos, which is actually the aim of all this self-practice or this critical work. And Foucault mentioned that by doing this kind of self-practice, we can use what he called parrhesia, or which is, as we see on the slide, frankness, truth, danger, criticism, and duty. Just briefly about the therapeutic discourse. The therapeutic discourse, as we mentioned, is very much related to modern societies today. And for example, Rose has in his work argued that the expansion of what he calls the psych industries are making individuals feel the need to constantly work on themselves and engage in self-improvement practices. And this they do with the help of professionals, which he has defined as belonging to the psych industries. For example, counselors, psychologists, psychiatrists, etc. Briefly about our data. We conducted interviews, semi-structured interviews with heterosexual male perpetrators who had all gone through treatment or psychological counseling. And their violent acts fall under the category that Jeff Hearn has called man's violence to known women. And the perpetrators had been then partners of or in some kind of intimate relationship with women. The interviews were open and semi-structured, and the topic is, of course, very sensitive, so we kept that in mind, and all the participants had a pseudonym, and we tried to change the context when we quote the interviews. We have put on the slides how we selected the participants, and concerning the data analysis and ethical concerns, we read the quotes again and again and tried to figure out themes. And after that, we used or were inspired by feminist post-structural theory in our analysis, but also Foucault's work. So now my colleague will talk about the findings, our main findings. Please, Guðrún.
Yes, and the findings contain examples of adapting new subject positions and of becoming a therapeutic subject. And then we, of course, come to some conclusions and briefly about the implications. Adopting new subject positions refers to how the participants gained new insights into their own behavioral and communicative patterns and in relation to their families. That is, how they acquired a new understanding of the violence. Agnar, a pseudonym, Agnar's childhood experience was marked by parental violence and alcohol abuse. And his adult life was marked by drug abuse. After his divorce, he sought help, and he says, "I'd wanted for a long time to change my life. I knew my temper was difficult, and I was doing wrong things. I found this psychologist I've been seeing for the last years who helped me immensely. How to react instead of becoming insane and attack people." And he continues, "I think I'll never hurt a woman again, you see. However, I am unsure whether I might hurt a man." Adopting new subject position also refers to fathering. Fathers perpetrating intimate partner violence have showed comparatively little interest in involvement with their children. For Agnar, fathering is an important part of his ethical work and in fact a part of his telos or goal of becoming a better man. And he says, "I show my kids much attention now. All my free time is centered on them. The best thing in my life is this intense interest and the will to spend time with them." And coming to the second subject or heading we wanted to exemplify, the participant emphasized self-introspection and confession in order to improve their angry or violent self and become better men. They all drew on therapeutic strategies learned during sessions, such as anger management or positive psychology. And Baldwin says, "In therapy, I learned to deal with it and manage more my expectations." And Eric says, "I have now realized better why I become aggressive. I learned about these anger phases in the program from trigger point A to trigger point B." And they did this not only in therapy, but by self-techniques of therapy, by working on themselves. And Eric says, "I have been thinking a lot about improving myself, working on myself." And now we come to the conclusions. Most of the participants became confessional subjects through therapy. As said, this refers to telling the truth about oneself and the environment. They talked frankly about their violent past, and in that sense they adopted a repentant subject position. They were also partly reflective and tried to explain their violence. However, they also made excuses for the violence committed and didn't critically question their own privilege and entitlement as men. All of them had internalized the therapeutic discourse and the psi vocabulary, which they frequently cited. Most of them emphasized improving care and contact with their children. What are the implications of this? The participant often blamed external factors or mental illnesses for their actions. Some expressed that they would always need treatment as they were still capable of committing violence. It can therefore be argued that our participants still need some guidance. Encouraging fathers to be open and honest with their children, making them aware of their father's recognition of the negative impact of their behavior, is an important part of programs for fathers who use violence. Thank you.
Thank you very much.